In the annals of history, few stories captivate the soul like that of a woman who rose from the shadows of a broken nation to become its beacon of hope. This is not just another tale of ancient times. This is the story of Deborah, a woman whose courage would echo through millennia, whose faith would move mountains, and whose leadership would transform a people cowering in fear into warriors of divine purpose. Picture, if you will, a land shrouded in darkness, not the gentle darkness of night that promises dawn, but the suffocating darkness of spiritual decay, moral collapse, and crushing oppression. This was Israel after the death of Joshua, a nation that had forgotten its God, abandoned its covenant, and surrendered its destiny to foreign powers. It was in this darkest hour that God chose to reveal his power through the most unlikely of vessels, a woman named Deborah. The year was approximately 1125 BC. The Israelites, once a united people under Moses and Joshua, had fractured into 12 separate tribes, each pursuing its own interests. The great victories of the past seemed like distant dreams. The walls of Jericho, the conquest of the Promised Land, the mighty deeds of their ancestors, all had become faded memories in a time when survival was the only priority. But darkness, as we shall see, is often God's chosen canvas upon which to paint his most brilliant masterpieces, and Deborah would become his brush. The death of Joshua had left a leadership vacuum that seemed impossible to fill. Joshua, the great warrior prophet who had led Israel into the Promised Land, was gone. Moses, the lawgiver who had brought them out of Egypt, was a distant memory. The generation that had witnessed miracles now lay buried in the dust, and their children had grown up knowing only stories of divine power, not its reality. In this spiritual wasteland, each tribe began to chart its own course. The tribe of Judah settled in the southern hills, the tribe of Ephraim in the central highlands, and Dan near the Mediterranean coast. What had once been a unified nation under God became a loose confederation of tribes held together by little more than shared ancestry and fading memories. The consequences of this fragmentation were swift and devastating. Unity of purpose gave way to petty squabbles. Shared vision dissolved into tribal selfishness. Most tragically of all, the covenant with the Almighty God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was gradually forgotten, replaced by the seductive worship of local deities. The Canaanite gods seemed so much more accessible than the God of Israel. Baal promised fertility and prosperity through simple rituals. Asherah offered sensual pleasures without moral demands. The golden calves provided visible, tangible objects of worship, unlike the invisible God who demanded righteousness and justice. And so, generation by generation, Israel drifted further from its divine calling. The altars of the true God grew cold, while the high places of false gods blazed with unholy fire. The law of Moses gathered dust, while the practices of their pagan neighbors became commonplace. The people who had once been set apart as a light to the nations, now indistinguishable from the darkness around them. This spiritual apostasy did not go unnoticed by the God who had chosen Israel as his own. The Almighty, who had delivered them from Egyptian bondage and parted the Red Sea, watched with growing sorrow as his people turned their backs on him. But God is not a God who abandons his promises. even when his people abandon theirs. His love is relentless. His mercy endures forever, and his purposes cannot be thwarted by human unfaithfulness. Thus began what scholars call the suit of the judges, a repeating pattern of sin-suffering supplication and salvation that would define this dark period of Israelite history. When Israel sinned by worshiping false gods and abandoning God's laws, he would withdraw his protection, allowing foreign oppressors to subjugate his people. When the oppression became unbearable, the Israelites would cry out to God in repentance. In response to their cries, God would raise up a judge, a divinely appointed leader, to deliver them from their enemies and restore justice to the land. It was a cycle as predictable as the seasons, yet each iteration brought new lessons about the character of God and the nature of human weakness. The pattern revealed both the depths of human sinfulness and the heights of divine mercy. It showed that God's love is not conditional upon human perfection, but neither does his grace excuse persistent rebellion. By the time our story begins in earnest, Israel had been trapped in this cycle for decades. They had experienced the deliverance of Othniel, who saved them from the oppression of Mesopotamia. They had witnessed the cunning victory of Ehud, who assassinated the obese king Eglon of Moab with a hidden dagger. They had seen the mighty deeds of Shamgar, who struck down 600 Philistines with nothing but an ox goad. Yet, despite the miraculous deliverances, the people seemed incapable of learning from their past. No sooner would one oppressor be defeated than Israel would return to its old ways, setting the stage for the next cycle of judgment and redemption. And now, as our tale begins, Israel found itself under the most severe oppression yet. For 20 long years, the people had groaned under the iron fist of Jabin, king of the Canaanites, whose capital was the fortress city of Hazor in the far north. But Jabin himself was merely a figurehead. The real terror came from his military commander, a man whose very name struck fear into the hearts of Israelite mothers when they whispered it to quiet their crying children. His name was Sisera, and he was the embodiment of everything that made the Canaanite oppression so devastating. Unlike previous oppressors who had conquered through sheer numbers or temporary alliances, Sisera represented something far more formidable: advanced military technology combined with ruthless tactical genius. Sisera commanded an army unlike any that had been seen in the ancient Near East. At its heart were 900 chariots of iron, not the lighter wooden chariots used by most armies, but heavy iron-reinforced war machines that could crush infantry formations and strike terror into the hearts of foot soldiers. These chariots were pulled by the finest horses, driven by expertly trained charioteers and equipped with razor-sharp scythes that could mow down ranks of warriors like wheat before the harvest. But technology alone does not make a tyrant. It was Sisera's character that made him truly fearsome. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man who delighted in cruelty, who saw mercy as weakness, and who used terror as his primary weapon of control. He was known to make examples of entire villages that showed even the slightest resistance, leaving them as smoking ruins to discourage others from thoughts of rebellion. Under Sisera's iron grip, the Israelites became prisoners in their own land. They could not travel the main highways which were patrolled by Canaanite soldiers. Trade came to a virtual standstill as merchant caravans were routinely plundered. Farmers could barely scratch out a living from their fields as the best of their crops was seized as tribute to their Canaanite overlords. The psychological impact was perhaps even worse than the physical oppression. An entire generation of Israelite children grew up knowing only fear and subjugation. They learned to speak in whispers to avoid looking their oppressors in the eye, and to accept as normal the boot of foreign tyranny on their necks. The proud heritage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob seemed like nothing more than fairy tales told by grandparents who had lost touch with reality. In the towns and villages of Israel, hope had become a rare and precious commodity. Mothers wept silent tears as they watched their children grow up in chains. Fathers felt the bitter shame of being unable to protect their families. The elderly mourned for the days when their God had been their shield and their strength. Yet it was precisely in this moment of darkest despair that God was preparing his most unexpected answer. For in the hill country of Ephraim, beneath the shade of a palm tree that would become famous throughout Israel, sat a woman who refused to bow to despair. While others whispered in fear, she proclaimed the word of the Lord with boldness. While others cowered before Sisera's chariots, she stood firm on the promises of Almighty God. Her name was Deborah, and she was about to change the course of history. The first thing you must understand about Deborah is that her very existence as a leader was revolutionary. In the ancient Near East, women did not typically hold positions of political or military authority. The societies of that time were rigidly patriarchal, with clearly defined roles that kept women in positions of subordination. For a woman to claim prophetic authority, to serve as a judge, and to command the respect of male tribal leaders was virtually unheard of. Yet Deborah was no ordinary woman, and these were no ordinary times. When God chooses to work through someone, human conventions become irrelevant. When the Almighty decides to confound the wisdom of the world, he often selects the most unlikely instruments to accomplish his purposes. And in selecting Deborah, God was making a statement that would resonate through the ages. His power is not limited by human prejudices or social expectations. The Bible describes Deborah with a Hebrew word that carries profound significance, Nabi, meaning prophet or prophetess. This was not merely a ceremonial title or an honorary designation. To be called a prophet meant to be a spokesperson for the living God, one who received direct revelation and was entrusted with communicating divine truth to the people. Prophets were the bridge between heaven and earth, the conduits through which God's will was made known to his chosen people. But Deborah's role extended beyond prophecy. She was also a judge, which in ancient Israel meant far more than what we might understand by that term today. The judges of Israel were not merely legal arbiters who settled disputes and handed down verdicts. They were divinely appointed leaders who combined judicial, military, and spiritual authority. They were meant to be living embodiments of God's justice, wisdom, and power. The palm tree under which Deborah held court became known throughout Israel as the Palm of Deborah. Located somewhere between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, this tree became a symbol of hope in a land that had forgotten hope. People would travel for days to bring their disputes before Deborah, not merely because she was wise and just, but because she represented something that had been missing from Israel for far too long, a leader who truly walked with God. Picture the scene beneath the spreading branches of this ancient palm. Men and women from all the tribes of Israel would gather. They came with their quarrels and their questions, their fears and their hopes. Some brought boundary disputes between neighbors. Others sought justice for wrongs committed against them. Still others came simply to hear a word from the Lord in a time when such words were rare and precious. And there in the dappled shade of the palm fronds, Deborah would listen with the patience of one who knew that every human problem was ultimately a spiritual problem. She would hear their complaints and their confessions with the compassion of a mother and the wisdom of a sage. And when she spoke, it was with an authority that came not from human appointment or personal ambition, but from her intimate walk with the God of Israel. Her judgments were renowned for their fairness and wisdom. She showed no partiality to rich or poor, to powerful or weak, in an age when corruption was commonplace and justice was often sold to the highest bidder. Deborah's integrity shone like a beacon. She feared no one except the Lord God of Israel, and her decisions reflected the perfect justice of heaven rather than the compromised expediency of earth. But perhaps most remarkably, Deborah possessed something that had been almost entirely absent from Israel's leadership since the death of Joshua: unwavering faith in the promises of God. While her contemporaries had grown accustomed to defeat and oppression, Deborah never forgot that her God was the same God who had parted the Red Sea, brought down the walls of Jericho, and defeated every enemy that had stood against his people. This faith was not mere sentiment or wishful thinking. It was the bedrock conviction of a woman who had spent years in intimate communion with the Almighty. She had learned to distinguish His voice from the cacophony of human opinions and fears. She had discovered that His promises were more reliable than the rising of the sun and more unchanging than the foundations of the earth. As the years of Canaanite oppression stretched on, people began to notice something different about the woman who sat beneath the palm tree. While others spoke of Sisera and his iron chariots, with trembling voices, Deborah spoke of the Lord of hosts who commanded legions of angels. While others calculated the impossibility of defeating a professional army with untrained militia, Deborah remembered that God had given David victory over Goliath and had caused the sun to stand still for Joshua. Her confidence was not based on a military strategy or political calculation, but on the character of God. She knew that the same God who had promised the land to Abraham would not allow His people to remain forever under foreign domination. She understood that divine delays are not divine denials, and that God's apparent silence does not indicate His absence or indifference. This faith began to kindle hope in the hearts of those who came to seek her counsel. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the whispered conversations beneath the palm of Deborah began to change. Instead of resigned acceptance of their fate, people started to speak of possibilities. Instead of focusing solely on Canaanite strength, they began to remember Israelite heritage. Instead of seeing only the darkness of their present circumstances, they began to glimpse the potential for a brighter future. But Deborah knew that faith without action remains incomplete. It was one thing to believe that God could deliver Israel from oppression. It was quite another to step forward and become the instrument of that deliverance. And as the months passed, Deborah began to sense that God was calling her to do something unprecedented in the history of Israel, to take active leadership in a military campaign against their oppressors. The idea would have seemed absurd to any rational observer. A woman leading Israel's army against the most powerful military force in the region. A prophetess commanding hardened warriors in battle against iron chariots. The very suggestion would have been met with incredulous laughter from Israel's enemies and nervous uncertainty from Israel's own people. Yet Deborah had learned not to limit God's power by human expectations. She had discovered that the Almighty delights in confounding conventional wisdom and accomplishing the impossible through the most unlikely means. If God could use a shepherd's sling to defeat a giant, he could certainly use a woman's faith to defeat an army. The call came as divine calls often do, not with thunder and lightning, but as a quiet certainty that grew stronger with each passing day. Through prayer and meditation, through seeking God's face in the early hours before dawn, Deborah became convinced that the time for Israel's deliverance had come. The 20 years of oppression under Sisera were about to end, not through gradual political change or diplomatic negotiation, but through decisive military action empowered by divine intervention. But Deborah also understood that God's plan involved more than just herself. As she sought the Lord for specific direction, one name kept coming to her mind: Barak, son of Abinoam, from the tribe of Naphtali. Barak was a warrior of some reputation, known for his courage and his skill with weapons. More importantly, he was a man who, like Deborah herself, had not completely forgotten the God of his fathers, even in these dark times. The choice of Barak was strategically wise as well as divinely directed. As a member of the tribe of Naphtali, he was intimately familiar with the northern regions where Sisera's forces were concentrated. He knew the terrain, the weather patterns, and the local population. He had personally experienced the brutality of Canaanite oppression and had every reason to desire its overthrow. Yet, when Deborah summoned Barak to meet with her beneath the palm tree, what followed was a conversation that would reveal both the glory and the frailty of human nature when confronted with divine calling. It was a dialogue that would demonstrate why God had chosen a woman to be the primary leader in this crucial moment of Israel's history. The meeting between Deborah and Barak must rank among the most significant conferences in military history, though it probably appeared quite unremarkable to any casual observer. Here was a woman sitting in the shade of a tree speaking earnestly with a weather-beaten warrior. There were no maps spread on tables, no armies assembled for review, no trumpets or banners or other trappings of military planning. There was only the word of the Lord spoken with quiet authority by a prophetess who had learned to trust God completely. Deborah's message to Barak was direct and unambiguous. "Has not the Lord God of Israel commanded you?" she asked, her voice carrying the full weight of divine authority. "Go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor. Take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and of the sons of Zebulun. And against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude at the river Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hand. These words must have struck Barak like lightning. Here was the confirmation he had perhaps been hoping for, but hardly dared to expect that God was ready to move against the oppressors of his people. The specificity of the command left no room for doubt about its divine origin. Mount Tabor as the staging ground, 10,000 troops from Naphtali and Zebulun. The enemy drawn to the river Kishon. Every detail was precise, purposeful, and pregnant with promise. Mount Tabor was a masterstroke of strategic positioning. Rising 1,843 feet above sea level in the Jezreel Valley, this dome-shaped mountain provided an excellent defensive position and an inspiring rallying point for Israelite forces. From its summit, commanders could observe the movements of enemy forces across the entire valley. Its steep slopes would neutralize the advantage of the Sisera's chariots, forcing the Canaanites to fight on foot where Israelite guerrilla tactics could prove most effective. The choice of troops from Naphtali and Zebulun was equally inspired. These northern tribes had borne the brunt of Canaanite oppression and had every motivation to fight with desperate courage. They knew the local terrain intimately and could move through the region with the speed and stealth of men defending their own homeland. Most importantly, they had not been as corrupted by foreign influences as some of the southern tribes, and thus retained more of their ancestral faith in the God of Israel. But it was the promise of divine intervention that transformed this military strategy from mere human calculation into an act of faith. "I will deliver him into your hand," Deborah declared, speaking not her own words, but the word of the Lord. This was not a guarantee based on superior numbers or better weapons, but a pledge from the God who had never failed to keep his promises to those who trusted in him. Yet, despite the clarity of the divine command and the promise of certain victory, Barak's response revealed the spiritual condition that had made foreign oppression possible in the first place. Instead of leaping to his feet with joy and rushing to gather his troops, Barak hesitated. Instead of embracing the honor of being chosen as God's instrument of deliverance, he began to negotiate the terms of his obedience. "If you will go with me, then I will go," Barak said to Deborah. "But if you will not go with me, I will not go." These words have echoed through history as both an honest admission of human weakness and a tragic example of failed faith. On one level, Barak's request was understandable. Military campaigns in the ancient world were uncertain affairs, and having a prophet present to provide divine guidance could mean the difference between victory and disaster. There was precedent for prophets accompanying armies into battle, and Barak's desire for spiritual support showed at least some recognition of his dependence on God. But on a deeper level, Barak's conditional obedience revealed a fundamental flaw in his faith. God had given him a clear command, a specific strategy, and an absolute promise of victory. What more could any military commander ask for? Yet instead of trusting completely in the word of the Lord, Barak was hedging his bets, seeking additional assurance, requiring further proof of God's commitment to the mission. This response must have grieved Deborah's heart, not because of wounded pride or personal disappointment, but because she recognized the spiritual implications of Barak's hesitation. Here was a moment when Israel desperately needed bold, uncompromising faith. The people had been crushed by 20 years of oppression precisely because their leaders lacked the courage to trust God completely. And now when God was offering them deliverance on a silver platter, their chosen military commander was still displaying the same tentative, conditional faith that had characterized Israel's spiritual decline. Yet Deborah's response revealed why God had chosen her to be the primary instrument of Israel's deliverance in this crucial hour. Instead of expressing irritation or disappointment at Barak's lack of faith, she immediately accepted his terms. "I will surely go with you," she said, demonstrating the kind of selfless commitment to God's purposes that true leadership requires. But Deborah also understood that Barak's conditional obedience would have consequences, and she was not shy about explaining what those consequences would be. "Nevertheless," she continued, "there will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." This prophecy was both a gentle rebuke and a gracious accommodation. Barak would get what he asked for, Deborah's presence and support in the campaign. But because he had lacked the faith to trust God's promise without additional assurance, he would forfeit the honor that could have been his. The decisive blow against Israel's oppressor would not be struck by Barak's sword, but by a woman's hand. Some commentators have suggested that this prophecy referred to Deborah herself, implying that she would personally deliver the final stroke against Sisera. But as events would unfold, God had an even more dramatic demonstration in mind. The honor of killing Sisera would indeed belong to a woman, but not to the famous prophetess who was already known throughout Israel. Instead, it would fall to an obscure housewife whose name was unknown beyond her own tent, whose courage would shine all the brighter for being completely unexpected. This promise of victory through an unnamed woman carried profound theological significance. It demonstrated that God's power is not dependent on human strength, reputation, or military experience. It showed that divine purposes can be accomplished through the most humble and unlikely instruments. Most importantly, it revealed that when men fail to rise to the level of faith that circumstances require, God can and will raise up others, including women, to accomplish His will. Having settled the terms of their partnership, Deborah and Barak began the practical work of organizing Israel's first military campaign in decades. This was no small undertaking. After 20 years of oppression, the Israelite tribes had become accustomed to thinking of themselves as victims rather than victors. The military traditions that had once made them the terror of their enemies had grown rusty through disuse. Most of the younger generation had never seen battle, while the older veterans were discouraged by years of defeat and submission. The first challenge was simply getting word out to the tribes that deliverance was at hand. In an age without modern communications, spreading news across the scattered settlements of Israel required careful planning and considerable risk. Messengers had to travel on foot through territory patrolled by Canaanite soldiers, carrying a message that could be construed as treasonous rebellion against established authority. Yet, as the word began to spread that Deborah, the prophetess, had declared God's intention to deliver Israel from Sisera's oppression, the response was remarkable. Men who had lived in fear for decades suddenly felt hope stirring in their hearts. Farmers, who had grown accustomed to having their harvest stolen, began to dream of freedom. Fathers who had watched their sons grow up under foreign domination started to envision a different future for their children. The rallying cry that went out across the northern tribes was simple but electrifying. The Lord has commanded it. Mount Tabor of victory is promised. These words, carried from village to village by excited messengers, had an effect that military historians still struggle to explain. Without modern propaganda techniques or mass media, without the promise of pay or the threat of punishment, thousands of Israelite men began to converge on the appointed meeting place. They came from the hills of Naphtali, leaving their fields and their flocks to answer the call. They traveled from the forests of Zebulun, bringing their hunting bows and their knowledge of woodland warfare. Some carried proper weapons, swords and spears, that had been hidden away during the years of oppression. Others brought farming tools hastily converted to military use, pruning hooks straightened into spears, plowshares sharpened into sword blades. What they all shared was something that had been missing from Israel for far too long: the conviction that their God was about to act on their behalf. The same people who had cowered before Sisera's chariots were now eagerly preparing to face them in battle. The transformation was miraculous, and it testified to the power of authentic prophetic leadership to kindle faith in even the most discouraged hearts. As the volunteers streamed toward Mount Tabor, their numbers began to approach the 10,000 that God had specified. But these were not professional soldiers marching in disciplined formation. They were a diverse collection of farmers, shepherds, craftsmen, and laborers, united only by their shared heritage as children of Israel and their common desire to see their oppressors defeated. To any military expert of that era, this ragtag militia would have appeared pitifully inadequate to face Sisera's war machine. They lacked uniform equipment, standardized training, and experienced officers. Many had never participated in a battle larger than a village brawl. Their weapons were a motley assortment of whatever had been available or could be improvised. By every conventional measure, they were hopelessly outmatched. But Deborah understood what the military experts did not: that battles are won not merely by superior equipment or training, but by superior morale and divine favor. She knew that 10,000 men fighting for their families, their freedom, and their faith could accomplish what 100,000 mercenaries fighting for pay could not. She had faith that the God who had given David victory over Goliath would not abandon his people in their hour of greatest need. The assembly on Mount Tabor must have been an extraordinary sight. Picture thousands of men, young and old, gathering on the slopes of this ancient mountain. Some arrived alone, having slipped away from their homes in the dead of night. Others came in family groups with fathers and sons standing side by side. Still others represented entire clans that had decided together to risk everything on God's promise of deliverance. As they gathered, these men would have shared their stories. 20 years of accumulated grievances against their Canaanite oppressors. They spoke of loved ones killed or enslaved, of crops stolen and homes burned, of children who had never known freedom. But they also shared memories of older time stories passed down from their grandfathers about the great victories of Joshua and the mighty acts of the God of Israel. The presence of Deborah among them was both inspiring and unprecedented. Never before in Israel's history had a woman taken such a prominent role in military leadership. Yet her authority was unquestioned because everyone recognized that she spoke with the voice of God. When she walked among the assembled troops, offering encouragement and proclaiming God's promise of victory, even the most skeptical warriors found their doubts melting away. Barak, meanwhile, was discovering that his initial hesitation about the mission was being replaced by growing excitement about its possibilities. As he looked out over the sea of faces gathered on Mount Tabor, faces filled with hope and determination rather than the fear and resignation he had grown accustomed to seeing, he began to catch a glimpse of what God could accomplish through people who were willing to trust him completely. The military preparations were necessarily simple, given the limited time and resources available. Barak organized the volunteers into rough units based on their tribal affiliations and their various skills. The men with proper weapons were designated as the shock troops who would lead the initial assault. Those with bows became the archers who would provide covering fire from elevated positions. The remainder were formed into support units that would follow up the initial attack and pursue any fleeing enemies. But the most important preparation was not military, but spiritual. Day after day, as the army gathered on Mount Tabor, Deborah would address the assembled troops, reminding them of God's promises and calling them to faith. She recounted the great deliverances of the past, from the Exodus from Egypt to the conquest under Joshua. She proclaimed that the same God who had parted the Red Sea was about to part the ranks of their enemies. These sessions were more like revival meetings than military briefings. Men who had not prayed in years found themselves calling on the God of their fathers. Warriors who had forgotten the songs of Zion began to sing the ancient hymns with tears streaming down their faces. The camp on Mount Tabor became a place where faith was rekindled and hope was reborn. As word of the Israelite gathering reached Sisera, the Canaanite commander must have initially felt more amusement than concern. The idea of a ragtag collection of farmers and shepherds challenging his professional army would have seemed absurd. His spies would have reported that the Israelite had no cavalry, no siege engines, and no apparent strategy beyond gathering on an isolated mountain. But Sisera was too experienced a military commander to dismiss any potential threat completely. He had not maintained his dominance over the region for 20 years by underestimating his enemies. The very fact that the Israelites had managed to assemble such a large force without his prior knowledge suggested that their organization was better than he had assumed. More troubling still was the identity of their leader. Sisera was familiar with Deborah's reputation as a judge and prophetess. He knew that she commanded enormous respect among the Israelite population and that her involvement in this uprising would give it a legitimacy that mere military adventurism could never achieve. If the Israelites truly believed that their God was commanding them to fight, they might prove more formidable than their poor equipment and lack of training would suggest. Therefore, Sisera decided to take no chances. He would bring the full weight of his military machine to bear against this Israelite rebellion, crushing it so thoroughly that no one would dare to challenge Canaanite authority for another generation. He began mobilizing not just his personal forces, but additional troops from King Jabin's army and allied contingents from other Canaanite cities. The centerpiece of Sisera's response was, of course, his famous chariot force. 900 iron chariots represented the pinnacle of military technology in that era. Each chariot was a masterpiece of engineering, constructed with iron-reinforced wheels and axles that could withstand the stress of high-speed maneuvers and violent collisions. The chariot bodies were designed to provide maximum protection for their crews while allowing rapid deployment of weapons. The horses that pulled these war machines were specially bred and trained for combat. Unlike ordinary draft animals, war horses were taught to remain calm amid the noise and chaos of battle, to respond instantly to their driver's commands, and to strike down enemies with their hooves when necessary. The psychological impact of hundreds of these magnificent animals thundering across a battlefield could be as devastating as their physical power. The charioteers themselves were elite warriors who had devoted their lives to mastering this complex form of warfare. Driving a chariot in battle required extraordinary skill, as the charioteer had to control his horses with one hand while wielding weapons with the other, all while navigating rough terrain at high speeds and avoiding enemy attacks. Only the most talented and experienced soldiers could hope to survive in such a demanding role. But Sisera's army consisted of much more than chariots. His infantry included professional soldiers armed with the finest bronze and iron weapons available. His archers carried composite bows capable of sending arrows with deadly accuracy, at distances far exceeding anything the Israelite militia could match. His support units included engineers who could quickly construct siege works, and specialists who understood the finer points of battlefield tactics. Most importantly, Sisera's forces had something that money could not buy, and training could not provide 20 years' worth of unbroken victory. They had never tasted defeat, never known the humiliation of retreat, never doubted their own invincibility. This psychological advantage was perhaps their greatest asset, as it gave them the confidence to face any challenge with supreme assurance of success. As reports reached Mount Tabor of Sisera's military preparations, some of the Israelite volunteers must have felt their courage wavering. The romantic excitement of answering God's call to battle was being tempered by the harsh reality of what they were about to face. These men knew firsthand what Sisera's chariots could do to infantry formations. They had seen the results of his military campaigns in burned villages and scattered bones. But it was precisely at this moment of growing anxiety that Deborah's faith proved most crucial. As doubts began to creep into the minds of some warriors, as whispered conversations started to focus on the enemy's strength rather than God's promises, the prophetess stepped forward with a word from the Lord that would transform fear into faith and hesitation into holy boldness. Standing before the assembled army on the slopes of Mount Tabor, with the morning sun painting the surrounding valleys in golden light, Deborah delivered what may have been the most important speech in Israelite military history. Her words were not recorded verbatim in Scripture, but their impact can be measured by what followed. Somehow, this remarkable woman managed to convince 10,000 amateur soldiers that they could defeat the most professional army in the ancient Near East. The key to Deborah's inspirational power was her absolute conviction that God had already determined the outcome of the coming battle. She did not speak like a general trying to motivate troops for a difficult campaign, but like a prophet announcing a victory that had already been won in the heavenly realm. Her confidence was not based on military analysis or strategic calculation, but on the unshakable certainty that the God of Israel never breaks his promises. "This is the day," Deborah proclaimed to the assembled army. "This is the day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has not the Lord gone out before you?" These words carried profound theological significance. In ancient Near Eastern warfare, it was commonly believed that battles were won or lost based on the relative power of the God supporting each side. By declaring that the Lord had gone out before them, Deborah was asserting that the God of Israel was personally leading their army into battle. This was not merely human warfare with divine blessing, but divine warfare carried out through human instruments. The impact of this declaration on the assembled troops was electric. Men who had been fighting private battles with doubt and fear suddenly felt those inner conflicts resolved. Warriors who had been calculating odds and assessing enemy strengths found their minds focused instead on the promises of God. The entire army seemed to undergo a transformation from a collection of worried individuals into a unified force committed to divine purpose. This transformation was visible not only in changed attitudes, but in changed behavior. The nervous chatter that had characterized the camp gave way to purposeful preparation. Men began checking their weapons with the careful attention of warriors who expected to use them effectively. The disorganized milling about of anxious volunteers was replaced by the focused movements of soldiers ready for battle. Most remarkably, the Israelite army began to display something that had been absent from their people for 2 decades: aggressive confidence. Instead of waiting passively on Mount Tabor for Sisera to attack them, they started pressing Barak and Deborah for permission to advance against the enemy. The hunters had become the hunted, and the psychological tables had been completely turned. This shift in momentum did not go unnoticed by Sisera's intelligence network. Canaanite spies who had expected to report on a demoralized rabble preparing for slaughter instead found themselves observing an army that seemed genuinely eager for battle. The songs that echoed from the Israelite camp were not funeral dirges, but victory hymns. The prayers that rose from Mount Tabor were not desperate pleas for mercy, but confident appeals for divine assistance in the coming triumph. Sisera himself must have found these reports puzzling and perhaps slightly disturbing. In his experience, amateur armies facing professional opposition displayed predictable patterns of behavior: growing nervousness as battle approached, increasing rates of desertion, and desperate attempts to negotiate surrender terms. Yet, the Israelites seemed to be growing more confident with each passing day, not less. However, Sisera was far too experienced a commander to be intimidated by enemy morale, no matter how high it might appear. He had seen enthusiastic militia charge bravely into battle, only to break and run at the first sight of real bloodshed. Confidence was no substitute for training, and faith was no match for iron chariots. If the Israelites wanted to fight, he would give them all the fighting they could handle. The Canaanite commander established his base of operations in the Jezreel Valley near the town of Harosheth Hagoyim, which served as his military headquarters. From this central location, he could deploy his forces in any direction and take advantage of the flat terrain that was ideal for chariot warfare. The very geography of the region seemed to favor his style of fighting, while the broken hill country where the Israelites were gathered would limit their mobility and strategic options. As Sisera's army assembled in the valley below Mount Tabor, it must have presented an awesome spectacle. The 900 iron chariots alone would have covered several acres, their polished metal surfaces gleaming in the sunlight like a deadly sea of steel. The thousands of infantry troops arrayed in precise formations according to their various specialties created an impression of irresistible military power. The sound of this vast army was perhaps even more intimidating than its appearance. The neighing and stamping of hundreds of war horses, the rattle of chariot wheels, the clash of weapons being tested and sharpened, the shouted commands of officers organizing their units, all combined to create a din that could be heard for miles. It was the sound of professional warfare, disciplined and deadly, preparing to crush amateur resistance. From their elevated position on Mount Tabor, the Israelite forces could observe Sisera's preparations with perfect clarity. Every man in their army could see exactly what they were about to face. There could be no illusions about the magnitude of the challenge before them. The enemy's superiority in numbers, equipment, and training was obvious to the most casual observer. Yet, instead of being demoralized by this overwhelming display of Canaanite power, the Israelite army seemed to draw strength from it. Each glimpse of enemy chariots served as a reminder of 20 years of oppression and a motivation for the righteous vengeance they were about to unleash. Every sight of Canaanite banners reinforced their determination to see those same banners trampled in the dust. This extraordinary response can only be explained by the spiritual transformation that had taken place among the Israelite forces. Under Deborah's inspired leadership, these men had rediscovered something their people had lost during the dark years of foreign domination: absolute faith in the power of their God to overcome any earthly opposition. They remembered the stories their grandfathers had told them about the walls of Jericho falling at the sound of trumpets. They recalled accounts of battles where the sun stood still and hailstones fell from heaven to destroy Israel's enemies. They began to understand that the same God who had performed these miracles in the past was ready to act again on behalf of his people. This faith was not mere wishful thinking or desperate hope. It was the mature confidence of people who had learned to see beyond immediate circumstances to eternal realities. They understood that the battle they were about to fight was not ultimately between Israel and Canaan, but between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness. And in that cosmic conflict, there could be only one possible outcome. As the two armies prepared for what would be one of the most decisive battles in ancient Near Eastern history, the stage was set for a confrontation that would demonstrate the futility of trusting in human strength alone. Sisera represented everything that the world considers powerful, superior technology, professional training, vast resources, and an unbroken record of success. The Israelites represented everything that the world considers weak amateur soldiers, improvised equipment, limited resources, and a long history of defeat. Yet the coming battle would prove once again that God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. The mightiest army in the region was about to be defeated by farmers and shepherds whose only real advantage was their trust in the promises of Almighty God. The day appointed for battle dawned with ominous signs that should have given Sisera pause. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the air carried the heavy feeling that precedes a severe storm. For a commander whose primary strength lay in chariot warfare, adverse weather conditions represented a serious tactical concern. Chariots required firm, dry ground to operate effectively. Mud and standing water could neutralize their speed advantage and render them vulnerable to infantry attack. But Sisera had committed himself to this campaign, and his reputation for invincibility was at stake. To postpone the battle due to threatening weather would suggest weakness and might encourage other subject peoples to question Canaanite authority. The Israelite rebellion had to be crushed quickly and decisively, regardless of atmospheric conditions. Moreover, Sisera may have calculated that the same weather conditions that would hamper his chariots would also demoralize the Israelite militia. Amateur soldiers were notoriously susceptible to adverse conditions, and a good soaking rain might accomplish what 20 years of oppression had failed to do, convince the Israelites to abandon their foolish dreams of independence and return to peaceful submission. From her position on Mount Tabor, Deborah observed the gathering storm clouds with very different emotions. While Sisera saw potential tactical problems, the prophetess recognized the hand of divine providence preparing the battlefield for Israel's victory. She had learned to read the signs of God's presence in creation, and everything she observed confirmed that this was indeed the day the Lord had chosen for his people's deliverance. As the morning progressed, Deborah received the final word from the Lord about the timing of their attack. The moment had come to transform 20 years of accumulated faith into decisive action. Standing before Barak and the assembled army, she delivered the command that would launch one of the most remarkable military campaigns in history. "Up!" Deborah commanded with prophetic authority. "For this is the day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has not the Lord gone out before you?" These words electrified the Israelite army like a lightning bolt. The waiting was over. The time for preparation had passed. The moment of truth had arrived. At Deborah's signal, 10,000 voices rose in a great shout that echoed across the Jezreel Valley and served notice to Sisera that the children of Israel were coming to reclaim their inheritance. The descent from Mount Tabor was unlike any military movement in recorded history. This was not the methodical advance of professional soldiers following a carefully planned battle strategy. It was more like an avalanche of righteous fury, a torrent of pent-up frustration and faith, cascading down the mountainside toward the enemy formations below. At the head of this human avalanche ran Barak, his earlier hesitation completely forgotten in the excitement of the moment. Whatever doubts he may have harbored about his own courage or the wisdom of challenging Sisera's army were swept away by the infectious confidence of his troops and the clear word of divine command. He had found his destiny as a warrior of God, and he embraced it with wholehearted commitment. Close behind Barak came the cream of the Israelite force, the men with proper weapons and some military experience. These warriors set the pace and direction for the entire army, their disciplined advance providing a framework around which the less experienced volunteers could organize themselves. Despite their amateur status, they moved with the purpose and determination of men who knew they were fighting for their families, their freedom, and their faith. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Israelite charge was the presence of Deborah herself in the midst of the attacking force. True to her promise to accompany Barak into battle, the prophetess had positioned herself where she could observe the unfolding action and provide spiritual leadership at the crucial moment. Her presence among the warriors served as a constant reminder that this was not merely human warfare, but a divine mission carried out by earthly instruments. As the Israelite army swept down from Mount Tabor, Sisera's forces were caught in the awkward position of trying to deploy for battle while storm clouds gathered overhead. The Canaanite commander had planned to use his chariots in the classic manner, a massive frontal assault that would shatter the enemy line and create panic among the opposing infantry. But the unexpected speed of the Israelite advance was disrupting his careful preparations. Moreover, the terrain between Mount Tabor and the valley floor was not ideal for chariot operations even under the best of conditions. The rocky slopes and uneven ground that the Israelites were navigating with surprising agility would pose serious challenges for wheeled vehicles pulled by nervous horses. Sisera found himself forced to choose between engaging the enemy on disadvantageous ground or allowing them to reach the valley floor, where they could potentially disrupt his formations. The Canaanite commander chose to attack, but his decision was influenced more by pride and overconfidence than by tactical wisdom. He simply could not believe that a rabble of Israelite farmers could pose any serious threat to his professional army regardless of terrain or weather conditions. In his mind, this battle was already won. It was simply a matter of going through the motions of destroying his enemies. This attitude proved it to be Sisera's first and most critical mistake. By underestimating his opponents and overestimating his own invincibility, he had already lost the psychological advantage that had been his greatest asset for 2 decades. An army that believes itself unbeatable is indeed formidable, but an army that assumes victory without effort is vulnerable to devastating surprise. As the Israelite charge gained momentum, the heavens began to open in fulfillment of the divine promise. What started as a few scattered raindrops quickly intensified into a torrential downpour that transformed the battlefield in a matter of minutes. The dust that had been kicked up by marching feet and chariot wheels was beaten down into slippery mud. Streams that had been dry gullies became raging torrents. The firm ground that chariots required became a treacherous quagmire. This sudden change in conditions might have been dismissed as mere coincidence by a secular historian, but to the participants in this ancient drama, it was clearly the hand of God intervening on behalf of his people. The same Lord who had sent plagues upon Egypt and parted the Red Sea was now using the forces of nature to neutralize the technological advantage of Israel's oppressors. The impact on Sisera's chariot force was catastrophic. Horses that had been trained for speed and maneuverability found themselves struggling simply to maintain their footing on the increasingly slippery ground. Chariot wheels that had been designed for firm surfaces began to sink into the mud or become entangled in debris washed down by the storm. What had been the most feared military unit in the ancient Near East was rapidly being reduced to a collection of expensive obstacles. But the storm that devastated Sisera's chariots seemed to energize the advancing Israelites. These men were accustomed to working in all kinds of weather. They knew how to move across difficult terrain, how to maintain their balance on slippery surfaces, and how to keep their weapons functional despite wind and rain. The conditions that neutralized Canaanite technology played directly to Israelite strengths. More importantly, the Israelites understood the theological significance of the storm. This was not just bad weather. It was divine intervention on their behalf. Every lightning flash illuminated the hand of God striking down their enemies. Every thunderclap echoed the voice of the Almighty, declaring His support for their cause. Every gust of wind carried the assurance that the Lord of hosts was fighting beside them. As the two armies finally collided in the muddy chaos of the Jezreel Valley, what followed was less a battle than a rout. The Israelite infantry, fighting with the desperate courage of men defending their homeland and families, crashed into Canaanite formations that were already disrupted by the weather and confused by the rapid pace of events. The psychological impact of their fierce attack was amplified by the obvious intervention of divine forces on their behalf. Sisera's professional soldiers, despite their superior training and equipment, found themselves unable to cope with an enemy that seemed to be fighting with supernatural strength and determination. Every tactical advantage they had counted upon was being neutralized by circumstances beyond their control. Their famous discipline began to crack under the pressure of fighting an enemy that refused to be intimidated and weather that rendered their weapons and formations ineffective. The collapse, when it came, was swift and total. What had begun as a confident advance by the most powerful army in the region degenerated into a panicked retreat, as unit after unit broke and fled before the Israelite assault. The iron chariots that had been the symbol of Canaanite military supremacy became death traps for their crews, mired in mud and surrounded by vengeful enemies who had 20 years of oppression to avenge. In the midst of this chaos, Sisera himself faced the most humiliating moment of his military career. The commander who had terrorized Israel for 2 decades found himself abandoned by his fleeing troops, his chariot stuck in the mud, and his invincible army scattered to the winds. For the first time in his life, he was forced to confront the reality of defeat and the prospect of death at the hands of those he had considered inferior. But Sisera was nothing if not a survivor. Abandoning his useless chariot, he began to flee on foot, hoping to escape the battlefield before the pursuing Israelites could identify and capture him. In his desperation to avoid the vengeance of his former victims, he was willing to abandon everything: his army, his reputation, his honor, if only he could preserve his life. Behind him, the slaughter continued as Israelite forces pursued the fleeing Canaanites across the rain-soaked battlefield. 20 years of accumulated rage found expression in this moment of divine vindication. Men who had watched their children grow up in fear were finally able to strike back at their oppressors. Warriors who had hidden their weapons and bowed their heads in submission were at last able to fight for their freedom with the blessing and power of God. Barak, leading the pursuit of the scattered enemy forces, must have felt a mixture of exhilaration and amazement at the miraculous turn of events. The same man who had hesitated to accept God's commission without additional assurance was now witnessing the most complete military victory in recent Israelite history. Every promise that Deborah had made on God's behalf was being fulfilled before his eyes in the most dramatic possible manner. Yet, even as he savored the taste of victory, Barak was mindful of Deborah's prophecy that the final honor would belong not to him, but to a woman. Somewhere in the confusion of the routed battlefield, Sisera was still alive and free. Until the Canaanite commander was captured or killed, the victory would remain incomplete and the prophecy unfulfilled. The fleeing Sisera, meanwhile, was discovering that survival on foot in hostile territory required different skills than commanding armies from a chariot. Exhausted by the unaccustomed exercise, soaked by the continuing rain, and disoriented by his rapid fall from power to powerlessness, he was beginning to realize that escape might prove more difficult than he had initially hoped. His military training told him to head north toward the safety of Canaanite-controlled territory, but his exhausted condition suggested that he would need shelter and rest before attempting such a journey. As he stumbled across the muddy landscape looking for any refuge that might provide temporary safety, his desperate eyes fell upon something that seemed to offer hope, a cluster of tents belonging to nomadic herders. This was the camp of Heber the Kenite, a member of the clan that had traditionally maintained friendly relations with both Canaanites and Israelites. The Kenites were descendants of Moses' father-in-law and had a long history of peaceful coexistence with their neighbors. Their neutrality in regional conflicts had often made them valuable as mediators and safe havens for refugees from various troubles. From Sisera's perspective, seeking shelter among the Kenites seemed like an ideal solution to his immediate problems. Their traditional neutrality suggested that they would not automatically turn him over to his Israelite pursuers. Their nomadic lifestyle meant that they would be familiar with survival techniques and might be able to help him escape to safety. Most importantly, their reputation for hospitality to travelers meant that he could expect at least temporary refuge while he planned his next move. What Sisera did not realize was that he was walking into the fulfillment of divine prophecy. In seeking what appeared to be safe shelter, he was actually approaching the instrument of his own destruction. The same God who had used storm clouds to neutralize his chariots was now using his own desperate flight to bring him to the place where his justice would be completed. The tent that would become Sisera's tomb belonged to Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Like most women of her time and culture, Jael was probably considered by male warriors to be essentially harmless, a source of potential comfort and assistance, but certainly not a threat to a professional soldier. This assumption would prove to be Sisera's final and most fatal mistake. Jael represents one of the most intriguing figures in this entire drama. Unlike Deborah, who was already known throughout Israel as a prophetess and judge, Jael was a complete unknown whose name appears nowhere else in Scripture. She was not a member of the covenant community, not a recipient of special revelation, and not someone who had been preparing for a role in Israel's deliverance. Yet, at the crucial moment, she would demonstrate a courage and decisiveness that would place her forever among the heroes of faith. When Sisera approached her tent, Jael faced a choice that would define not only her own destiny, but the fate of entire nations. She could honor the traditional obligations of hospitality and provide genuine refuge to this fugitive from justice. She could maintain her people's political neutrality and avoid involvement in the conflict between Canaanites and Israelites. She could play it safe and allow someone else to determine Sisera's fate. Instead, Jael chose to become an instrument of divine justice, though she may not have fully understood the theological implications of her decision at the time. Something within her, whether divine inspiration, moral conviction, or simply an intuitive